Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this session of Meet the Member with Privacy Rules. This week we have Kelly Dickson from Macpherson Kelley. She is part of the privacy law practice. Her practice also includes what she likes to say, sort of anything that may help your business when there's an issue or problem in your business. So that would cover sort of contracts, competition law, privacy law, etc. Kelly Dickson is a principal lawyer with Macpherson Kelley located in Melbourne. And without further ado, hello, Kelly.
Hello, Lauren. It's good to speak with you again.
Good to speak with you. How have you been?
Been very, very well. Things here are very busy in Australia as far as privacy goes. So it's actually a really good time to be speaking with you. And I think, we can give a bit of information for listeners to this particular session about just what's going on here in Australia.
Yeah, that would be great. Kelly recently joined us at our Zonglun conference in Beijing, so we had a chance to catch up there, and she had a chance to speak to a nice audience in Beijing about Australian data privacy law. So Kelly, maybe do you want to tell us a little bit about the climate in Australia and what's been going on? You know, everyone talks so much about the GDPR, but we don't hear as much about, other jurisdictions. So what is new in Australia with data privacy?
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of an exciting time for privacy, if you can ever really say that privacy compliance is something that can be exciting like that. But I think that certainly over the last year in particular, there has been a lot of focus, as you said, around the world, particularly for GDPR, the enforcement phase of that coming in. And so we've had in Australia certainly some focus on that, but particularly in Australia, people thought that perhaps the world was going to end when GDPR came in. It didn't. Business has kept on going. There still is a great appetite from businesses in Australia to be doing dealings with other businesses and with people in other countries all around the world, and particularly in Europe. So that has been actually an interesting thing for me, that while I was away with Privacy Rules recently over in Beijing for the Zonglun conference, the focus there really was on GDPR. That's not something that has impacted our practice to an enormous extent in terms of the clients that we've been dealing with here. But aside from GDPR and all of the work that businesses are doing for that compliance around the world, Australia has actually been moving along with quite a few privacy reforms, and our privacy landscape is already in Australia very different to what it used to be. And on the horizon, there are definitely some more changes that are also coming as well. So I think to really oversimplify it and maybe to make a gross exaggeration, the Australian privacy landscape is not as onerous and not as complex as what businesses, particularly in the EU, need to deal with. The Australian privacy regime is, in my view, a little bit more simplified, a little bit easier to comply with, but we are definitely seeing moves towards a more GDPR-style type of privacy regime.
Right.
So while I was away in Beijing, I did get the opportunity to speak to some clients over there just about the privacy framework that we have in Australia. And we have a privacy regime that is federal, so that applies to all of the states and territories in Australia. But then we also have various state-based regimes as well. So depending on where the business is located and where the data subjects are located, there are some different rules that can apply there as well. But I do think that, listeners to this podcast and businesses that are looking to come into Australia and need to comply with the privacy regime here, it's not something to be afraid of. It's not something that is overly difficult to comply with. And I think that is a little bit reflective of the way that we typically do business here as well. Our regime is fairly no nonsense. I think that with a bit of common sense, it's quite an easy thing to comply with. And so the approach that we like to take with our clients here is just to really get down to looking at what is the business that you run and then doing a few things. So the first one would be to have a look at what privacy practices are already in place in that business, because what we find is that if a business is already compliant, particularly in a jurisdiction like Europe, there will already be a privacy policy. There will already be policies to do with how you handle complaints to do with personal information. So a lot of that is just very easily able to be used in the Australian context and just modified as it needs to be to make it relevant to the particular peculiarities that the Australian context has.
Right. That makes sense.
So, yeah, and, you know, we deal a lot with privacy matters in this space. So the first step, as I said, is to just conduct a bit of an audit to see what policies and procedures are already in place, then just amend them for the Australian application. Sometimes there are a few gaps that are picked up out of that process. And so part of our work is then just advising those businesses about how to plug those gaps. But really the approach that we like to take is very sensible, practical and hands-on, because what we see with a lot of privacy compliance is that it typically isn't seen as a value add to business. You know, it's not something that immediately increases sales, or it's not something that's as fancy as a new brand launch, and not as exciting as those sorts of things. So our approach for all of this is get in place the processes that you need, get it all bedded down. The benefit to the business is that, particularly in the Australian context, as I think it is for all of the rest of the world as well, privacy is an issue and a concept that is becoming more and more on the radar for Australian people. And so when businesses can just demonstrate very quickly and easily that they understand the concept, that they have their privacy compliance in hand, businesses and people in Australia both feel more confident then to deal with that particular business. Yeah.
I just had a couple of follow-up questions on that, and this was just also for our audience. So was there a lot of panic amongst your clients, kind of, you know, after hearing everything in the press about GDPR and sort of, you know, coming to you immediately after that and saying, oh my gosh, what do I have to do to comply? Or, you know, if I have any business happening in Europe, did you get sort of a wave of panicked clients or no?
No, there certainly was a huge wave of panic in Australia. And I think that was fed a little bit because Australia has had privacy laws in place for a good 35 years, right. But it hasn't really been a focus for Australian people and also for Australian businesses. So our regime was fairly laid back. It was a little bit bare bones, if I could even say that as well. And that has been the case in Australia for quite a long time. So really, a lot of businesses that were complying with the Privacy Act would have a privacy policy and they would have a set of systems in place. Right. But there certainly wasn't any big fine that was attached to a breach of those privacy requirements. And it wasn't really something that people in general made a lot of fuss about. And so when GDPR was announced, there was a lot of panic and a lot of interest here in Australia, not only because of the enormous fines that are available under the GDPR. There is no comparison at the moment between the GDPR fines and the Australian regime. And so I think that really made people sit up and say, what is happening with privacy elsewhere in the world? What are the practices and the best practices that people are putting in place elsewhere? And what is it that government and regulators are requiring us to do as perhaps an Australian business, but when we're doing these overseas deals? Right. And so, then certainly some panic.
Yeah. Have you noticed at all, because this is something we talk about, at least anecdotally, here in the States and Europe. I mean, a lot of businesses now will have a chief privacy officer, for example. or a chief ethics officer even. But they'll have multiple roles now dedicated almost entirely to privacy. Have you seen that same trend in Australia? And again, sort of since the GDPR, even if it's not necessarily in reaction to changes in Australian legislation?
Yeah, it is definitely an item that businesses do need to consider. And in Australia, there is a requirement under our privacy regime that you have a privacy officer who is the one who is responsible for making sure that the business is compliant. But typically also they take on the role of acting as the complaints officer too, in a sense, so that where there is a complaint or an investigation in relation to a potential privacy breach, then that privacy officer is typically the one who takes on that role and has the ultimate responsibility for dealing with, addressing, sorting it out. So it has certainly been a long time practice in Australia that businesses will have a privacy officer. I think that anecdotally as well, that has been a role that typically has been taken on by a director in the business or by a senior manager. Often it's a role that has been fulfilled by, for example, the marketing manager of that particular business. And in our experience, it has been sort of a side role. For a lot of businesses, it's not been a dedicated appointment to that role. It's just another function of the rest of the roles that they play in their business. But with GDPR being introduced, with a lot of the changes that have occurred in Australia and that are also coming up, I expect to see this privacy officer role becoming a bigger role, taking up more time for the person within the business who has been allocated that particular responsibility. And we may well see it turning into a full-time role.
Yeah. And this is just kind of a question, for me, but also for the audience. What is the makeup of what kinds of businesses do you see most of in Melbourne? I just am not fully aware of, what kind The businesses are very diverse. I work in our Dandenong office, and Dandenong is a suburban region of Melbourne, Victoria, and the Dandenong region has always traditionally been a very strong manufacturing presence. So a lot of our clients that are very local to our office here are in the manufacturing sector. But Macpherson Kelley also has an office in the CBD of Melbourne. We also have an office in Sydney, in New South Wales, and we also have an office in Brisbane, up in Queensland. So our presence is all along the eastern seaboard in Australia. And so because of that great spread, our traditional client base is typically manufacturing, professional services firms like accountants, real estate agents, and other types of firms like that. And we also see a lot of financial services as well, and a bit in the health service space too. So it's quite a broad range of clients, but our privacy regime can apply to all of those and will apply to most of those in various types of ways as well. So one of the other things that I think, particularly for the privacy space and for the work that we do and the contacts that we have with the other members of PrivacyRules and the way that we can connect with them, is that particularly being a manufacturing base in Australia, we deal with a very large number of foreign-owned subsidiary clients. So that will be where the parent is located in the United States, or the parent might be somewhere over in the EU, and there is a local Australian-based subsidiary. We've got a very big practice as far as dealing with foreign-owned subsidiaries go. And privacy is just one of those issues that sits smack bang in the middle of that for those types of businesses. Because for a lot of these larger global corporations, they will have privacy regimes that are in place, and particularly with a global focus that have been rolled out
to all of the companies that are within that particular entity. And so the challenge for the local subsidiaries there is about how do they integrate what their parent company is requiring to be done and what is being done reciprocally elsewhere in the world, but then how to localise that for the Australian application. And so we spend a lot of time doing those dealings to support the local directors and the local employees in those businesses, but also developing some really great relationships with the parent companies to help educate them on what the legal landscape is like in Australia, where it differs to even just the approach that the legal fraternity take in other jurisdictions as well. So I'm really excited, particularly for that aspect for our association with Privacy Rules, because it just opens up a whole heap more experts for our clients to be able to tap into, not only if they're coming to Australia, but also for Australian businesses that are looking to launch in other jurisdictions too.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then because you were in Beijing and because we did have such a wonderful time there together, I just wanted to maybe get, one or two highlights from you from that trip. I think it was, I think we can both agree that it was a wonderful success. You gave a wonderful talk to Zonglun's clients and friends and audience there, and all the other members did as well. So I'd just love to hear, what your perspective was on it.
I think that the first highlight definitely has to be the personal, selfish one that comes out of that. And it was it was so good and so exciting to be able to meet in person some of the other experts from within the Privacy Rules network. These are people who I've seen pictures of, or I've emailed with, or I've spoken to, but to actually get together and make that personal connection face to face, I think was a really beneficial thing. You can create the relationship so much more quickly and advance those relationships and that trust that you can build by being face to face in front of someone. So I think that was the personal highlight for me, because it was just really great to be able to finally meet some of these other people that we're dealing with as well. But the other thing that struck me, particularly from meeting with and seeing the Zonglun clients, was just how sophisticated they were and how ready they were to talk about privacy concepts and to learn more. They were not an audience that privacy was new to, and that means that you can actually really get into a better depth of conversation with them and deal with some of the more complex matters because they were engaged, they were ready. Some of them had certainly done their homework and come to the conference armed with really great, insightful questions. So that was something that I really enjoyed too.
I agree. I thought it was, as you said, a very sophisticated audience.
Absolutely. There's probably just one last thing that I'd like to leave for listeners in relation to the Australian privacy context. And I said at the beginning of all of this that Australia had gone from a relatively relaxed and laid back privacy regime. It has over recent years been steadily increasing in compliance. So I think that privacy in Australia, it's certainly doable. The compliance can be done. It's not as onerous as GDPR, but certainly watch this space because there will be changes throughout 2019 and beyond.
Well, Kelley, thank you so much for your time. I think we all feel that we've gotten to hear, a bit more about your practice now and get to know you a little bit better. And I hope that everyone tunes in and enjoys it. And we will talk soon, whether on another webinar or at another conference. And best of luck to you.
And thanks very much for speaking with me.